Hello everyone. This is I guess, a two-part, or the second part of what's fast becoming a series about the current situation with XL Bullies. The first one covered some of my initial concerns, some of the discussions around the politics, how we got here, and that's on Webinar Vet. And I spoke about a variety of different things, which kind of was the platform for what I'd like to discuss today is that the information that we've got recently over the last couple of weeks about what and when this legislation and how it will look like has come out from the government regarding XL Bullies. So today really is an opportunity for me to pro bono I put together some resources and basically put it onto the internet so that everyone has a bit of access about where we are now in hope of being able to better delineate and look into the details of this legislation. I don't know how long this is going to be. I'm hopeful that I'm able to get through it within an hour, but I've got quite a little bit of information in front of me. Some of my concerns, some of the legislation, some of the caveats, some of your questions, and we'll kind of just try and cover as much of the topics possible. I'm sure I'm going to miss things on the way. But yeah, I think this is an opportunity for us to talk about this and kind of look at the finer details. And if someone is a little bit confused, hopefully this will give them a bit more information about where things may and could go and what's in play at the moment. So let's get straight into it. So I've already set the scene in the previous one. Again, it's on Webinar Vet. Unfortunately, you do have to pay for it, but I think it's like £10 or something like that. So I'll put a link in the description or here or wherever. But where are we now? So there's some advisory given about the kind of timeline and what the legislation will look like with regards to XL Bullies in particular. And so where we are now. So, and this is verbatim. So from the 31st of December 2023, it will be against the law to sell an XL Bully, abandon an XL Bully, give away an XL Bully, breed from an XL Bully, have an XL Bully in public without a lead or muzzle. From the 1st of February 2024, it will be a criminal offence to own an XL Bully in England and Wales unless you have a certificate of exemption for your dog. You will need to adhere to strict rules, such as microchipping, muzzling, lead in public, and there's also some information about neutering as well. I'll try and get through as quick as possible because, again, I'll put a link to this information in the bio, wherever it will be, so you don't have to stand here and listen to this, but I'm just going to go through it so everyone's fully aware and we're on the same page. You also need to neuter your dog. If your dog is less than 1 year old on the 31st of January 2024, it must be neutered by the 31st of December 2024. If your dog is older than 1 year old on the 31st of January 2024, it must be neutered by the 30th of June 2024. So two very important dates about the neutering schedule for not only people with XL Bullies, but also vets in the veterinary community as well, for sure. We recommend that you arrange this dog to be neutered as soon as possible to ensure you meet those deadlines. And the next section is something we'll come back to, but is what is a bully effectively, and there is some breed outline with regards to what constitutes a bully. But we'll come back onto that because we'll break it apart. The next up is keeping an XL Bully. Again, you being the person with XL Bullies, you will have until 31st of January 2024 to apply for this exemption. The application will be subject to £92.40 application fee to cover admin costs. To keep an XL Bully, again, microchipped lead, we've already been through that. The person needs to be over 16 years old. Take out insurance against your dog injuring other people. This is provided for the Dog's Trust membership, which is, I believe, is £25 a year. And be able to show a certificate of exemption when asked by a police officer or a council dog warden, either at the time or within 5 days. So you have a bit of a buffer if you're not carrying that exemption with you. DEFRA will provide information on how to apply for exemption. What else? There's also a little bit about muzzle training. So effectively, as we know, 31st December is 2023 is a cutoff line for lead and muzzle in public. And so the suggestion here is to start actually muzzle training. And they've given us a link to Blue Cross, Dogs Trust and PDSA for how to start getting started on that. Once your XL Bully has been neutered, you should ask for a vet to fill in the proof of neutering form and return it to DEFRA. So we as vets will be asked to either have some type of history or provide some proof that has been neutered, and then we can independently send it to DEFRA, I believe. If your dog has already been neutered, you can ask for it to fill in the form and again return it to DEFRA. So we'll either be doing the neutering or providing proof. If neutering was undertaken by a different vet or a different practice, your current vet may have to check the neutering has taken place. You may have to pay a fee for the vet to do this. It's probably a consult fee unless we do a special fee. Alternatively, you may be able to contact your previous vet to fill in the form. You should ask your vet to complete and return the relevant form to the index of exempted dogs. If you choose not to keep your XL Bully, you should take it to a registered vet to be euthanized even. You can claim £200 compensation, it's very kind of them, towards the costs. You and your vet will need to fill in a compensation form to make a claim. DEFRA will provide more information on how to do that as well. So effectively, unless you abide by the set rules, your dog will either have to be on a certificate exemption and attached to the person who has a dog at that particular time, because again, we're not talking about adoption or rehoming. We're talking diametrically about if you have an XL Bully by a certain date and you apply for certificate exemption, that is your dog. And there's no other way that dog's custodianship or caregivership, whatever is the right terminology, can be then passed on to someone else during that process. So certificate exemption is directly connected to the person who took out or applied for that. Beyond that, you're looking at euthanasia. And so we'll come on to that as well. So this is some advisory for vets. Vets may be asked by XL Bully owners to euthanize the dog when the compensation scheme opens. Owners can claim £200 per dog. Rescue centres can pay £100. And we're waiting for more information, of course. While it is the responsibility of owners to use the official definition and guidance to determine if their dog is within the scope of the ban, vets should be able to recognise dogs as being XL Bully dogs for the purposes of undertaking euthanasia. Vets will be not expected to report XL Bully dogs and their owners to the police. So within the realm of what we're required to do, is not our responsibility to do it. It is the owners, as the technical term in this legislation says, and so it's not our job. Vets should read the official definition of an XL Bully, read the RCVS Code of Conduct for Euthanasia of Animals, contact the RCVS and the VDS, the Veterinary Defence Society, for queries about professional obligations for euthanasia. Tell owners about the ban on XL Bully dog that starts on the 31st of December and what they need to do to either keep or give up their dog. From the 1st of February 2024, it's criminal offence to own an XL Bully unless you have a certificate of exemption. And we've covered all this, really. And we come back to what is a bully, the definition. Let's have a look. Insurance. Waiting for more information, as we always are. Yeah, and I think ultimately that is the kind of head and tail of most of it. So, I mean, we've got through that quite quickly. There probably is a little bit of information that I have omitted, but for by and large, that is where we're at. So we have a couple of dates, and you know the hard line begins on the 31st of December. You know, for microchipping, lead and muzzle, you need to apply for a certificate of exemption, and you need to have that by the 1st of February 2024. And depending on your dog's age, whether a year old or not, by the time that this starts, there are certain different dates that having them neutered by. So, where should we start? So, Let's do things in order. I think it's probably the best way to go about it, instead of pulling apart the big bits and then getting to the kind of finer details, because they all kind of mesh together as far as I'm concerned. So the first thing that came to mind really was the focus on the 1st of December and kind of, for me, the lead and muzzle training in public. And now today is the start of November. And, this particular part of this process, getting your XL Bully, regardless if micro or XL or whatever, and all of the different denominations, which we'll come on to later, the idea, at least, is that there is a certain amount of pressure to get them lead and muzzle trained. Now, this is a kind of huge anecdote and a vast assumption, but I would assume that most of the XL Bullies that are, and this is 50,000 dogs or more, as expected to qualify for this particular legislation, at least in the UK, is that most of them are lead trained, probably, with a certain degree of ease, really, because that is a standard for most dogs. But muzzle training, now we know muzzle training can be done at all ages, but I can imagine at least that that's going to be difficult for some people to do. And there is a certain amount of pressure. Now, I think it does make sense, at least for me, to kind of give people some resources. But for me, at least, the idea of kind of putting that pressure on people, which is obviously a legal requirement, and having a best part of, a couple of months to do that, is a fair period of time. But I can imagine that, given the expectation, at least, of not having to do that, and some of the habits and some of the kind of fine tuning with the other wider behavioural context of any dog, and I'm not saying this XL Bullies, but XL Bullies are big, boisterous dogs, as many of us will know, at least, that particular expectation might be difficult for some people without any type of external support. And I think that this may be a very small caveat, and I guess it would probably come under the line of, well, what is an obligation for any type of carer with regards to muzzle training their dog going forward, and how, if they can't muzzle train a dog, then actually is there a concern about the behaviour capacity that dog may or may not have in other contexts, basically. But I think when it comes to the reality, at least, there might be quite a few people who will struggle with that basic tenet, really. But I think a wider thing that I'm more concerned about is that, and that's something I've mentioned before, given that these dogs are very athletic, and they're chosen and their breed, whatever loose expectations they are, kind of in the widest sense, a lot of them are very energetic and athletic. That denying them the opportunity to utilize that athleticism may actually create its own unique problems. Now, it doesn't take a genius to understand that an athletic dog, or a frustrated being, frustrated animal in itself, will often manifest undesirable behaviours as a result of that. And I'm not saying that, we're all fully aware that a lot of these different cases of kind of injury caused by XL Bullies and other dogs in the public are a lot of the time related to off the lead situations. But what I would say, at least, is that some of these situations, as far as I'm aware, have come from home settings, and that actually it wouldn't count that they originated from a public setting initially. Not all, but there are some settings where it's not started from a public setting, and the dog has escaped or made or attacked certain people within the confines of a non-public space anyway. And so what I would say, at least, is that there is a concern from my behalf, at least, that there will be certain dogs that will be, and I'm not sure what proportion, but there will be certain dogs that will as a result of not having the capacity to stretch their legs and utilize a certain level of space that an energetic athletic dog will need, there may be manifestations of poorer behaviors as a result of that. So one thing that I think may occur with regards to the next step, at least, is with regards to these dogs that require a certain amount of space because they're being athletic and not having that opportunity, is that we will probably see a proportion of dogs that were probably relatively well managed and used to getting a good amount of exercise being kind of negatively or having a negative response to the lack of opportunity to kind of go off the lead. But this may also be an opportunity for what we might see as more private holdings. I mean, there's one thing that I've noticed, at least, is that the bully community is, and have we seen as in the response to this particular legislation and kind of dialogue, at least, is that the community is quite well knit. And so what you might find is ways to try and circumnavigate the issue around, muzzles and leads in a public sense, and, certain people opening up large private holdings to allow for certain types of spaces for dogs to kind of stretch their legs and things like that. Again, whether or not that will come to fruition or not is a big question mark, but it's just something to consider. And then I guess whoever was, and whether or not that would be a liability that anyone would want to take on, given the kind of poor context that this particular legislation has come out. Something to consider. With regards to, athletic dogs, that there was and energetic dogs, I went onto Dogs Trust website, and there was something that I saw which was very important to highlight, because obviously Dogs Trust have a very central stake in regards to how this is going to go forward, at least, or you'd like to think so, at least. But there's a mention, at least, about how poor health and welfare dogs and the welfare for dogs gets worse if they aren't getting enough off-the-lead exercise. And there's a mention on their website, at least, that behaviour problems for dogs if they are interacting with other dogs. And again, poorer social well-being for dog owners if they're meeting fewer other owners. And a negative impact on the local dog-friendly businesses. There's this, and it says last thing is responsible dog owners given a bad name. And I think there's one thing, those last two points about responsible dog owners being given a bad name and a negative impact on local dog-friendly businesses, is that actually that the optics of XL Bully owners is already being, slighted in kind of public domain. But also what we're seeing, at least, is that the context of regards to the welfare and behaviour of these dogs is and can be worsened by this current legislation. And for me, what that does is create its own questions about how well thought out this was. And we also have this situation of creating a problem, or thinking that we're trying to solve a problem and actually kind of propagating it. And this leads really well into talking about neutering. So again, for those who do or don't know, there are potentially a variety of behavioural problems and potentially physiological problems, actually, that can be related to neutering and quote-unquote premature neutering. And by premature, I mean in the context of done in prior to addressing, for example, behavioural issues, or as we know with other breeds, at least, that when you neuter dogs at certain ages, especially younger ages, that they may have a variety of other problems as well. Focusing on behavioural problems in particular, there is some conflicting evidence but from my interpretation at least, is that there's enough research to suggest that neutering a dog before you've addressed some of the behavioural issues, and I'll bring your attention to some of the research that I have had a look at, that it's possible that neutering males in particular before puberty may correlate with increased aggression directed to strangers, more so strangers and strange dogs. So I found a nice, a kind of a couple of bits of research. One was the reasons for and behavioural consequences of male dog castration, a questionnaire study in Poland. But also that there was another bit of research, I think it's called Aggression Towards Familiar People, Strangers, and the Consequences in Gonadectomized and Intact Dogs. And I've highlighted a certain section here. And this section says, and I quote, however, dog aggression is a complex issue, and aggressive behaviours towards humans and other animals in the household should be analysed separately from aggression towards strangers. Previous research has shown that castrated dogs are less aggressive towards family members than intact dogs, but are more likely to behave aggressively towards unknown people. And this is by Farhoudi et al. And I believe this was in 2018. And as I mentioned, this is the aggression towards familiar people, strangers, and conspecifics and gonadectomized and intact dogs. So have a quick look at that. And what's really interesting about that particular distinction, at least, is that by separating whether or not it's a familial bond or a stranger, that the value of getting a dog neutered, a male dog in particular neutered, may have some kind of positive outcome for people within your own family. However, what we are discussing here is dogs which aren't, for example, attacking people within their own family necessarily, or less so, but strangers. And so neutering a dog, there is some information in it here that neutering or castrating dogs may not or reduce anxious behaviours in fearful dogs. Key part, fearful dogs. And even increase the number of dogs with fear of strange dogs, humans, and sound phobias. And the conclusion of this reasons for behavioural consequences of male dogs castration by Marcelina, is it Kreeser? Excuse me if I'm butchering your name. Is that it can be concluded, and this is her research, concluded that while castration can resolve many undesirable behaviours in male dogs, the arguments for and against neutering should always be considered on an individual basis. And so the suggestion, at least, is that case by case, things can make things worse. And that from her research, at least, that fearful behaviours potentially increased with kind of strange dogs and humans. So basically people then in your familial setting. And I think this is really, and this was in 2022, so relatively recent. And it's something that I've been hearing for quite a few years from behaviourists, and I think it's, it won't jump as a surprise to a variety of people to hear this type of information, because it's something that a lot of vets have been advocating for. I myself, one of them, that until a behaviourist is happy to address and say that these types of behaviours are related to hormones, that fearful behaviours should be something that are addressed before castration to at least minimise the possible net effect of an even greater regression in the behaviours or desirable behaviours that we want within a home setting or outside in public. And I think this is something that again draws back to this idea of, we have a problem that is happening, and we're seeing the clinical, or not the clinical, the manifestation of certain other behaviours which haven't been mentioned with regards to this legislation, fertility clinics and lockdown and puppy pandemic and all of that malarkey, and actually creating a problem that worsens the problem, and then using that problem, which is liable to make things worse, especially in the immediate future, and then say that as an example of why these dogs are overrepresented in this target group of being these BSL, breed specific legislation dogs, where banned breeds and things of that ilk. I think that, for me at least, with regards to neutering, is another reminder of how distant the government are when it comes to what we're telling them and how we approach that particular problem. Because again, we are leaning into a variety of behaviours which are likely to, in some contexts, to worsen the situation, which is obviously the last thing anyone wants, really. And from my perspective, I feel it misses a very large opportunity to speak to the veterinary community on that particular sense, or that particular field. Applying for exemption, we still have no information. It's been the best part of 2 weeks since we've had all this legislation come out. I know from disparate anecdotes that certain groups of people are saying that people are ringing to ask, and crying and very frustrated and upset, saying they having to put down their dog because they can't muzzle train their dog, or he's and already finding difficulties and very distressed with this current information. And I think that's something that's been reflected from what I'm seeing in forums and other vets that are very concerned about these kind of dates. The next thing is the proof of neutering. Now, I'd like to think that your average male dog will be quite an easy one to work out. Not always, but quite an easy one to work out. But I think at least there's a variety of different bits of information which make this problematic. And first and foremost, we have to address the elephant in the room. Female dogs, female XL Bullies. What test are we doing apart from the history, what test are we doing to prove or deny that this is the case? And I think what we are leaning to, as far as I'm aware, I had a kind of look to see if there is any kind of test out there, or CT scanners or whatever. And I think from what I found, at least, there's no real concrete way to work out if a dog's been spayed. There was some suggestion about looking for your spay scar, but again, if you've done an XLAP, for those who don't know, XLAP is short for explorative laparotomy, which when we have a look inside, so basically have a scar from where we've looked inside. That may also constitute, and I think ultimately to have that type of proof, in absence of that information before, or the kind of goodwill nature, what we're looking at least is doing a lot of XLAPs. Is that the suggestion? And is that the financial responsibility of someone who's got an XL Bully? I guess it would be, and that provides I'm assuming for many practices and many carers as well, that particular price for that particular procedure might be difficult. Now, pricing that up, it's very much at the discretion of veterinary practices around the country, about how they enforce that and how they price that. But I find it very strange, in absence of that information, which I suspect might be absent, then getting a dog booked in for a spay, in the possibility to find, and I guess technically speaking, they'd have to pay for it anyway if they had no recollection, because it would be an XLAP, or you would just go on the idea of proviso that they're getting a spay anyway. But it is all these kind of hidden costs, and if you have a client who's adamant dog's been spayed, they have no proof of it, I guess you'd have to go for a spay procedure and just kind of see what happened. Because without that information, you cannot get your certificate of exemption. But I just think it's a huge admin concern, not only for veterinary practices, not only for people who can't get in contact with previous carers, but also sending off that information en masse to the best part of 50,000 plus dogs is going to be interesting. Again, we have no framework of what it's going to look like. We don't know if it's a hub, we don't know if it's a piece of paper, we don't know if it's 3 pages, we don't know if it's 10. And DEFRA, as far as I'm aware, are kind of scrambling to get that information together. Scrambling would be a word, because it seems, from my understanding at least, a lot of people are getting very frustrated about the fact that this information wasn't brought out aligned with or in line with the kind of government's legislative changes at the same time, which would have helped a lot of confusion about the kind of finer details, or if they had access to the finer details, or had a game plan about the finer details going forward, which seems to be not the case. So it's an interesting one, and by interesting one I mean it's one which is going to make the deadlines, I believe, was it June and December, when I'm sure everyone's going to be rushing to get their XL Bully castrated or spayed, depending on their ages, if they're going to get them neutered anyway, as a legal requirement at least, how that's going to look. So yeah, I think we have that to look forward to. But again, we still don't have the guidance from DEFRA, and we're waiting on that. And by all means, it will probably be something else I kind of deep dive into as well, in the similar way that I have done here, and share my thoughts on it. The financial aspect is something that also is really important. Again, another reason why people are very frustrated with DEFRA, because we have the £200 to help support for euthanizing people's XL Bullies. Now, £200, for a lot of places, that would cover the actual act of euthanasia, but wouldn't cover the act of any form of partial cremation for lots of places, not including the possibility that if some of these dogs are very boisterous, that they may require certain forms of sedation or support. And there's a variety of different things that may make this £200 very interesting. Because ultimately it's going to be one of those situations about who foots the bill. Now, and I think this is one thing that's my concern, is places like the PDSA and so on and so forth, and RSPCA, and Dogs Trust, no doubt, are probably going to be hit very hard by this particular part, because as a vet, I don't own a clinic, but if I did own a clinic and someone needed a sedation and a euthanasia, and it was in excess of the £200 that's being offered, then what happens about that gap? Now, if we're anticipating tens of thousands of dogs going through a variety of veterinary clinics, and having them euthanized, which may or may not happen. We don't know how the public are going to go. Are they going to be very much for spaying and castrating and signing up for this form and getting Dogs Trust insurance, and then probably being very finding it extremely difficult to get conventional insurance, pet plan, many pets, whatever, and all these different kind of costs that some of them might be a little bit more problematic to get to. But if there is an issue with that gap, then it's not going to be the vet's liability to take on. And so it starts to become that £200 for euthanizing a dog, possibly needing sedation and all the trimmings, not including cremation. It starts to get very messy very quickly, and it is something that I think people are going to find very difficult to do. And not only that, but then having to go through the process of claiming it back, and the timeline for that, and what that looks like, and if there are certain caveats to whether or not you're eligible for that, we all remains to be seen. And I think this is again where DEFRA's the DEFRA information will be really, really important to kind of get a hold of. Again, we are still waiting. where else are we? So, yeah. Now, the next thing I would say is, apart from all the hidden costs and X, Y, Z, you know, is what is an XL bully? Now, this is the elephant in the room that's been on everyone's lips since this whole saga began. What is an XL bully? And we've got a large bit of information, and what I'm going to do is probably put, again, all the links for everything else will be in the bio or whatever. But the definition itself is quite vague. And one thing that I'm getting from furious messages in my inbox, is by design at least, that XL Bully, the XL Bully definition is so wide and vague that actually is like casting the largest fishing net and catching all sorts, crabs, whales, fish, you name it, plankton, coral, everything. And I've had people say to me, Ryan, my Rottweiler qualifies, my Mastiff qualifies, my thing qualifies, my that qualifies, my Cane Corso qualifies, my German Shepherd qualifies. What about me? What about me? What about that? And I think this is really the kind of the basic tenet of it. Now, as something quite fun, I have done my own little experiment to help show why this particular definition of an XL bully isn't particularly helpful. So what I did is, when I, being as petty as I am sometimes, is I went onto an AI image generator and I copied and pasted verbatim the vague outlines, and I put it into an AI generator and basically said, do your thing. And so now I'll pop up on the screen some of the things that came as a result of that kind of fun engagement with AI art. And what you should be seeing, at least, is a variety of things that look nothing like an XL bully, in the widest sense that we know what XL bullies are. And what this is to show a distinction of is not that we don't know what XL bullies kind of are. We know, we've seen enough pictures of kind of what they are. But ultimately, that it's not that it's about XL bullies, that we kind of know what they are. It's that it also includes so many other breeds within that definition. And down the line, when you have an AI image creator that reads everything so literally and has to use its understanding of what a dog is in the most, I guess, plural of forms, and has this particular idea of, musculature and height and so on and so forth, and this is the manifestation of it. What we're looking at is a kind of a carte blanche to name pretty much any dog within a very kind of pretty broad parameter as potentially being an XL bully, on the face of it at least. And that in itself is problematic. Now, I'm sure that if push came to shove, that if there was a concern about, or a challenge to the idea of it being an XL bully, that if any dogs here that popped up, that they would probably not win in the favour of what you challenge this particular dog to be. However, it is fair to say and be critical of the fact that a quite broad spectrum definition does not satisfy the requirements that we need as a community to have faith in the next process of what is an XL bully and what isn't, to have faith in this process that actually we're going to have a way to be able to define this breed. And this is the exact reason that we were telling them beforehand, and by we I mean the veterinary community, that the definition of an XL bully is so wide it will not satisfy the capacity to fill, all sorts of, dog wardens and make it a very difficult place for anyone with a relatively muscly, solid dog to operate, because it also be like what I said, it kind of gives this kind of carte blanche to the police or your local dog warden to say, well, technically within the jurisdiction of what the definition is, this is an XL bully. And I think my problem is with that is that when it's so broad spectrum, it can create so many more problems, and be a bit of an opportunity to kind of overextend the powers that be to kind of indiscriminately choose whatever dog counts as a muscly solid dog as being an XL bully. And that, as you know, I don't need to explain how that can be a potentially a really huge problem. Now, there's something I've actually picked up as well, which is I found this in the Dangerous Dogs Law Guidance from Forces by DEFRA 2009, and it was talking specifically about Pitbull Terriers, which, as we know, one of the, I think it's 4 or 5 dogs now on this kind of banned breed list, effectively. And I'll read it out to you, some of the fun bits. The following information is aimed to provide a starting point for identifying Pitbull Terrier types PBT. It should not be seen as an exhaustive list of characteristics, and further expert advice and guidance must be sought at an early stage. There are no photographs provided to assist with this, as these animals can look very different yet have a substantial number of the characteristics present and be considered a Pitbull Terrier. So already we have a platform that having and I quote, where is the quote? Substantial number of characteristics to be considered a Pitbull Terrier. So this is a framework. This is a framework for the Pitbull Terrier. With all the characteristics that we've been given by the government to define an XL bully, if we put them all into an AI image generator, and they produce nothing like an XL bully, if we are using the same standard, which I think is relatively reasonable to do, based on what we've had for the legislation around Pitbull Terriers, which we've had for donkeys now, a substantial number of characteristics can qualify a dog to being a Pitbull Terrier. So let's just say that let's say 80% of the characteristics of the legislation of what qualifies for an XL bully or a Pitbull Terrier can mean they count as an XL bully, right? Or a Pitbull Terrier? Does that make sense? So what we're saying is that we don't even need all of the information there. We can have a fraction, a substantial amount being I don't know, not 4 out of 5, 8 out of 10. There's no fraction that we've got. It's just a substantial amount. And so ultimately, that again leads to this general emptiness, for lack of better words, about the value of breed-specific legislation and how vague and driven by a variety of the factors that can lead to this particular point where we have dogs which aren't XL bullies coming under this very same legislation, and also for sure putting a lot of people into a quite anxious state about whether their dog does or doesn't qualify for this particular legislation, which again, it kind of typifies the point we're trying to make here. It doesn't work because there is no standard to hold it to, because it is just a bit vague, and it is legal speak, for lack of better words. But yeah, I'll continue on. So it says here, although the law does not require, and this is coming back to the 2009 with Pitbull Terriers kind of guidance, although the law does not require a suspected Pitbull Terrier to fit the description perfectly, it does require there to be a substantial number so that it can be considered more Pitbull Terrier than any type of dog. So I guess we have a framework that if it is more of an XL bully or a Pitbull Terrier in this particular case, then that would constitute that dog being under the legislation for being banned. But again, when it comes to the nitty gritty of it, more is in quotation marks, and what constitutes more, and how, and there's no actual information about how that relates to the inherent behaviors that we have superimposed onto these dogs based on a breed. And so that is I thought that was quite an interesting kind of perspective to have. So we're looking ultimately for a dog, and this is probably how it will be transferred forward with XL Bullies, that is more XL Bully than anything else, but by what margin we don't know. And we need to have substantial characteristics to qualify, but that substantial nature we don't know. And the characteristics that we do have access to, which has been made by the government and DEFRA and whoever, is so empty that it does cover a variety of different breeds. And when we try to use a standard from, and again, using AI image, a creator at least, to help standardize what information an objective source, pretty objective source, it doesn't create anything like an XL Bully when it has access to all that information. Again, it's not rocket science to say to be concerned about why this may be of concern. There's even a point here that it says the standard used to identify a Pitbull Terrier is set out in the American Dog Breeders Association, and again it refers to something in the Pitbull Gazette, Volume 1, Issue 3, 1977. Please refer to this for the full description, also relevant cases. And so again, we're having to draw from external sources for what may or may not qualify, whether or not this information will be transferred over for XL Bullies by the American standard, because I understand that there's some looser definition of it in the US. So yeah, a lot of interesting things, and I think the kind of gravity of how vague it is will lead us into our next point, which is enforcement. So as mentioned before, there's suggested 50,000 at least dogs that would come under this legislation, or legislative change, and how that's being enforced is going to be interesting, because I'm understanding that it will be based on local authorities' priorities, a bit like the idea of acts of animal welfare concerns, and how different local authorities kind of step that up. We've seen that with regards to fertility clinics, and how certain places have been allowed to kind of run free reign without any type of police involvement. The how different local authorities prioritize or don't prioritize ear cropping, despite it being illegal. And again, maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think police have a lot on their plate, and it will be interesting to see how they enforce this to this extent, really, countrywide, in England and Wales in particular, obviously. And I think it allows itself, and that's how I feel about this, it allows itself to kind of villainize certain kind of areas and groups and demographics in particular, because of how not only the police but public perception of XL Bullies kind of does fuse together when it comes to reality. And we've seen the optics of what people think, the public think XL Bully carers are and where they're from. And I think that sets a really dangerous precedent, to be honest with you. And I think that needs to be addressed, and not kind of swept under the carpet. And that's something that needs not be swept under the carpet by the veterinary community as well, to be honest with you. It's very easy to villainize certain groups of people for being a certain type or from a certain social background, for having XL Bullies, or more like to have XL Bullies. and trying to treat this as a more endemic sign of education and how we value dogs within society. But we'll try and wrap up on talk about that a little bit later. One thing that's also is clear is that, and I mentioned this in the last time that I did this talk with Webinar Vet, at least, is that the welfare of seized dogs is a huge potential issue. We've known that when we're talking about the kind of the nitty gritty of the legislation and the arbitration of whether or not it's an XL Bully, a Pitbull Terrier, blah blah blah, that the time that these dogs are kept, effectively isolated and unable to see their original caregivers, can be years at a time. Now, on one side, I'm thinking about the sheer numbers of people that may or may not have to have their dog seized, and then years on, like the space for that particular type of escalation and potential backlog if you have a large amount of dogs that are being seized in a short period of time, paying for them, feeding them, not letting them have access to their carers who may be completely well within their right to be the best person to manage their behaviour, but also the possibility and distinct possibility that their behaviour, if it wasn't bad going into that particular situation, being kept isolated essentially for X amount of period of time without their family, may actually lead to worsening outcomes with regards to behaviour over a year or 2 year period. And I think, again, the idea of frustration and being cooped up and being an athletic, boisterous breed typically may actually lead to greater problems, whether or not they even qualify for an XL Bully, because we know, again, it's very vague about what qualifies. And then after all that process, at least, then we might have to be talking about, well, their behaviour is untenable for them to be within, the public in any shape or form, and that may lead into a concern around, things like euthanasia. And this is something else that's really important. I think probably kind of pivot onto this now is and something many vets and vet nurses and veterinary professionals are most worried about. Which is the euthanasia of healthy dogs. Now, I had a quick look of the Code of Professional Conduct for Veterinary Surgeons to try and, because this is something that's the advisory by the government to kind of refer to. And in point 8.2 here, so section 8.2, it says no veterinary surgeon is obliged to kill a healthy animal unless required to do so under statutory powers as part of their conditions of employment. 8.5, the primary purpose of euthanasia is to relieve suffering. It says, as a kind of adjunct, these may include the extent and nature of the disease or injuries or other treatment options, the prognosis and potential quality of life after treatment, the availability and likelihood of success of treatment, the animal's age, other disease or health status, and the ability of the owner to pay for private treatment. There, at 8.9, there may be circumstances where a request is made by a client for the destruction of dog as above, where in the clinical professional judgment of the veterinary surgeon, destruction of dog is not necessary. For instance, where there are no health or welfare reasons for the dog to be euthanized. Moving on very quickly, clients may have a contract such that a dog can be returned to the shelter, or so it be an appropriate discuss with the client prior to euthanasia. So the idea of rehoming to a shelter, basically. Alternatively, there may be another individual willing to take responsibility for the dog, who may be named on the microchip database, and this may also be discussed with the client. Now, in this particular case, this will be illegal. Full stop. So you will not be able to send your XL Bully back to a shelter, or you may not be able to you're not able to move your details by design, your certificate of exemption, to someone else, as far as what we've understood from the legislation at the moment. So that opportunity doesn't really apply to us anymore. You throw that in the bin. That's not helpful. There is a part 8.16, so the very last point of this Code of Professional Conduct for Veterinary Surgeons, is that and this is basically under the Dog Act, that a destruction order may be made by the court, justice, or of the peace or sheriff, and the destruction of a healthy animal is normally involved. In these circumstances, a veterinary surgeon asked to destroy a dog should, unless there is a genuine threat to human safety, request a written and signed order from one of the appropriate statutory authorities. Now, unless I'm missing something, this is probably just my lack of understanding at least. If you have, and this is probably a situation that will come around, if you have a XL Bully that's completely healthy, there's no concern about its capacity to live a happy, healthy life. However, the owner has elected to say goodbyes, whatever. If you then request, as part of this process, a written and signed order from one of the appropriate statutory authorities, where does that lie with your requirement to do that? Because we've just literally read that there may be circumstances. No veterinary surgeon, is obliged to kill a healthy animal unless required to do under statutory powers as part of conditions of their employment. And so we have this situation where it's like, can we have our hand forced, legally speaking, to do that? Because it's my understanding, at least, that, certain companies, I know IVC have said this, that, a lot of, and this is, I'll comment this later, that if new grads are refusing to, and I think there was a kind of 200 new grads, I've written it somewhere, if a new grad denies the opportunity to euthanize a completely healthy dog, but we then get this, this statutory a signed order from one of the appropriate statutory authorities, that's the court, justice, of the peace, or sheriff, then we are legally required to enact that. And so there is this caveat, and this is the thing that I think is what the case is. I'm sure if legal heads will be able to tell me the finer detail. I've tried to look into something a bit more clear, but this is all I have. That we will be legally required to go ahead with that. Now, it's a bit of back and forth, but we will have a legal requirement to go ahead with that particular order. And that in itself poses a real concern for the general kind of mental health, and our veterinary community's main concern is that effectively we can have our hand twisted in that sense. And I say twisted because it is a twist, effectively, because you have no legal powers to almost say no if you're being ordered to do it, effectively. But I think in the context is then we have this other part to add to it. So this is from I think it's from the CPS. If a dog poses an immediate threat to the safety of public, then it can be lawfully ordered to be destroyed by the police or other responsible person. This comes from the fact the dog is classed as property and it is lawful to humanely destroy it if it is causing immediate damage to property, animals, or people. Now, there is a further distinction here. Again, you have, let's use this kind of mind game. You have a healthy XL Bully, and you have a healthy XL Bully. You can see I'm quite confused by this myself, because reading through this yesterday over and over and over, I wasn't able to get my head around it. You have a healthy XL Bully, you refuse to, and you are either can be ordered to, and how that manifests itself, or technically speaking, if the police can justify the immediate threat to safety of the public or property or whatever, then they can do that themselves. And there is a thought process in my head, at least, which suggests if a dog is by design dangerous, is there a platform at least to say that because of its inherent big quotation marks inherent dangerous nature, will that give the police full jurisdiction to destroy a dog? Do you see where I'm coming from? Does that give them that opportunity to destroy a dog and be reinforced by the legislation for that, even if it's healthy and happy and there's nothing else going on, because it's innately and genetically predisposed to being dangerous? Will the police have extra powers to do that in absence, for example, if a vet says no, an order comes through, and also what is the kind of knock-on effect of refusing, getting that order in and continuing to refuse? Like what is the legal basis of refusing at that level? What is that? Is that the point where you have to get the VDS in? Like, what's required as part of that process? Because I'm not saying that's exactly where we're going to be going, but I think it's fair to say that if, for example, IVC are going to be supporting new grads, and I'll come on to that in a little bit, supporting new grads, to say that if they say no, that they'll support them, then what's the kind of legislative process with regards to that? Like, what is the legal precedent? Like, what's the next step of that process? And that's something that I'd really be interested to hear about. I know I was a bit confused, at least, but every time I read this I get so confused about actually how that's going to manifest itself in the grand scheme of things going forward, because you have a healthy XL bully, which many of them are, and you have happy, healthy XL bullies. And if someone does not want to go through that process, or says, look, I can't muzzle train my happy, healthy, XL bully, I'm struggling, but I can't, for whatever, I just don't think there's quality of life with all the things that needs to happen, blah, 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 blah. I want to say our goodbyes. I refuse. Statute order, I continue to refuse. Then what happens in that process? Or will the police be able to kind of take that decision from me and destroy that dog independently? And will they? Like in reality, there's a wider context with regards to the general mental health of people having to do this and been preparing for this going forward. There was a huge amount of questions about what the next step is. I thought this would be really helpful as well. There's a BVA guide to euthanasia, and I've kind of jumped most of it to go to non-justified euthanasia. I should have highlighted it, but there's a bit of it here that says, when a vet feels a euthanasia is not justified, then there is no reason for them to perform it, though a second/another opinion should be offered. Limitations on time or fears of damage to public relations are not legitimate reasons for killing an animal unnecessarily. Owners may be encouraged to rehouse an animal. However, if they will not take this option, or they can't, should not be afraid to refuse to euthanize. Blah, blah, blah. If both veterinarians, so you've sought outside opinion, refusing euthanasia, is a real danger that animal will be abandoned or inhumanely killed, and it is a real danger, the RCVS may be consulted for advice. An option is to place an embargo on the decision for a defined time to explore alternatives. There are no alternatives, for example, with regards to going to rescue centres. Again, confusing. So again, we have this kind of ethical weird standpoint here with refusing euthanasia, and actually what we're required to do, and how responsive vets and veterinary professionals will be to the possibility of needing to have their arm twisted, or will the jurisdiction be deferred to the police to destroy dogs in absence of veterinary compliance? And then also on top of that is, the big question mark of if there will be veterinary compliance. Potentially all these things could be spurious and empty because vets understand or not happy to, but are ready to comply on that particular level. So here's the information that I read from this article with regards to new grads. So it says 200 newly graduated IVC vets found 94% they would refuse to euthanize a healthy XL bully with no behavioural issues if an owner asked them to do so, and insisted the company would support any of its staff who took that stance. And so this is a very clear position about the idea of the mental health of people and how they feel about it at the moment. And 94% is pretty resounding. I know it's only 200, but I wonder what that extrapolated out to the veterinary community. I probably think, no offense to the veterinary community, I probably think that number would drop. But I would probably expect it to be around the 90%. So pretty much in line with that, to be honest with you. But it's interesting. It'd be interesting to find out. And I you know, that's, yeah. So I think the point is that the platform here is that there is a concern about people having the right to do their job in the best way they feel, but also coming face to face with this legislation and being pushed into a certain situation where the vets may or may not be refusing that particular option, and then either the police take over that option or they're being ordered to legally. And then what happens if that thing does or doesn't happen? There is something that came up just as a kind of caveat before we talk about the final, to kind of wrap this up, is that I found something that said under the 2015 order, the substitution of a person in charge of an exempted dog is only permitted if the owner or person dies or is seriously ill. So what this is important to add, and I just found it, is that if you have a certificate exemption and you die, then in that situation, then can be transferred. Or you're seriously ill, then the XL bully can be transferred. Again, I don't know if, I assume this does apply for XL bullies, because again, this is from the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Services. But again, it will be interesting to see it, like the finer details of this. And again, this is from quite a bit of digging, trying to pull this different information, all these sources together. So yeah, it's a tough one. This is, if you want to read that a little bit more, or you're interested in law, then Crown Prosecution Service about dangerous dog offences, the CPS is all online. It was helpful at certain points. And then, you know, that might be of, you know, there's some finer details in there which aren't actually listed in the guidance. When I say guidance, the legislation now that the government has shared with us. So the last thing I'd do is just talk about the questions that people have been asking for me, and just talk about that. So I'm listening. One of the expos done nothing wrong. One of you know, my followers kind of sent me a message about, and ultimately it's nothing about intent. It's nothing to do with intent. You know, as mentioned over the last hour or so, this is nothing to do with intent. This is the broad spectrum casting of the net that this particular depiction, which is a very fair way of putting it, because it doesn't seem to be that accurate, of XL bullies, is that they are too much of a risk by design to be classed as a non-dangerous dog. And so whether the XL bullies has a history or anything, that they are being, there is a collective responsibility for all XL bullies for the acts of XL bullies in a context, at least, but almost all dogs, to be honest with you, because when we're talking about kind of injuries caused by dogs, we're not talking just about XL bullies. What we're talking about is that they are, as far as what we've seen, they are overrepresented as a breed in these types of acts, and so what they've been deduced is nothing to do with actually where XL bullies come from, or the government have deduced that it's nothing to do with where the XL bullies have come from, or anything of that nature. It's that the dog is by design dangerous. So yeah, Next, someone else sent me a message saying, how do you reason with someone who would choose euthanasia over castration? I've covered this obviously to a certain extent, but from my own perspective, there's something to be said about something that was mentioned in this BVA guide to euthanasia is contextually speaking, is that how do we feel about the possibility of people who cannot provide for whatever reason, or do not want to provide for whatever reason, because everyone is allowed in this particular, in this world at least, or at least in the UK, to have jurisdiction over what their priorities are. Now, because dogs aren't family, technically speaking, they are property, that people have the complete choice to humanize or dehumanize them within the scope of not being, the Animal Welfare Act. And so within reason, at least, it is fair to say that they have complete choice over that particular process if they want to expedite that. And there is a concern, at least, is that if they weren't going to a veterinary professional to have their dog euthanized, then there is a concern about what other ways they would get that done, and go ahead and get that done, where the relationship between the vet and the client and the owner or the carer is strained already after the denial. And I think there stands to reason that, yes, that would fall foul of any type of situation where we'd want it to happen, and it would be probably, in most cases, that what I'm alluding to is that it'd probably be illegal. But there is a genuine concern, at least, that that if we were to refuse, what other acts would people do to ultimately not have to take on the financial burden or the behavioural burden of their XL Bullies needing to hit all these marks and possibly pulled up in the street and apply for this and etc. etc. And that is probably where people like the BVA and the Dogs Trust and so on would be ideal, I would say, at least, to have some type of shared understanding of what their position is as a reflection of the veterinary community. And I think some type of forum where people who care enough to talk about it would sit down and say, look, this is where the veterinary community wants to go. This is what we should do. This is the stance we're taking. This is my thoughts, excuse me. Next up is list of requirements fit my Frenchie. It brings into play the kind of vague assessment and the kind of ramifications of such a position, really. Sorry for your Frenchie. But it, again, I think it's the idea that the description falls foul of any type of real distinction about what we want. And I think what will probably end up happening is one of two things. They will continue to redefine and do it on the fly. Or maybe what they'll do is kind of work on, getting dogs in and then just having a very slow kind of legislative process for defining each individual basis, which could take very long. Because the idea is that, and that's something I mentioned in previous talk about it, was that there is a political appetite out there for this ban, and I think that's the thing that people aren't. In the veterinary community, we live in a bit of a bubble, like most people live in their own version of their bubble, but there is a political appetite and for it, and I think it's clear to me that the actual workings and mechanism for this is not very good currently, as far as I'm concerned. But it doesn't need to be good. It needs to look good. It needs to look like something's happening. And so, the actual manifestation of that, I've no doubt, is going to cause some pretty catastrophic problems in the near and distant future if it's not addressed. But yeah, hopefully no problems with your Frenchie, because they shouldn't really qualify. But yeah, technically speaking, you're probably correct. Next question was advice for vet nurses, or student vet nurses in particular, but just vet nurses, about how to follow this up. I think for me, the best stance for a veterinary professional, until there is some kind of commonality, common ground from the powers that are we pay money into to kind of set a standard, the BVA and whatever, and charities and things like that, to kind of sit down and use all their big brains and come together, is to kind of just regurgitate what's there and kind of take as much a hands-off responsibility as, so that you don't become the optics or the center of someone else's frustration about these legislative changes. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So I just following government advice, and say that, and just kind of let them say there are variables that none of us are in receipt of at the moment, and just say that it casts the kind of net very far, and it's better to be on the safe side, and maybe, depending on what you believe their dog to be, just try and say, look, this is the timeline, this is the information that we do have, and there is some nuance that's required effectively, and potentially some of these dogs, it may benefit from, castration and neutering, but again, it's really hard to say. We're talking about a very emotive topic, and talking about, hitting all these standards or saying our goodbyes. And I just say, just follow the government website and just say, I really wish I had something for you, but I don't. And it is distressing for all of us, because again, we're fighting a bit of an uphill battle to get any real clear information about all the different nuances that none of us are able to get access to. So, can we refuse XL Bullies? Yes, technically, but like I said, there's context, and ultimately the question is what happens if you refuse entirely and completely? Unless I've misunderstood this kind of statutory order, which is highly possible, I'm not legally trained, then potentially you may be ordered by a court of some sort to go ahead and do it anyway. I guess they'd probably elect to that if you were the only option available, and I'm sure there will be other vets who were available who may have a slightly more proactive response to doing it. But again, refusing to euthanize is not just about your legal obligations. It's an obligation to your mental health, but also it's an obligation to the projected welfare of said animal, and what could be envisaged on that animal if you aren't the person to do it in a safe veterinary environment. What could happen as a result of that? I'm not trying to hold anyone to a standard, because I don't think that's always how it's going to be or will be. At the same time, there is a genuine thought process about, unless there is a kind of shared stance we're all taking, then in a kind of case-by-case basis, it may be in certain situations, despite the dog being healthy and happy, that what you get an impression of is that something bad's going to happen without your veterinary involvement, which could be injurious or could be quite a horrible way to go. And that's an inference about XL Bully owners. That is an inference about the reality of the kind of fear that certain people may or may not feel they need to go to enact it. And you know what? There's a lot of trust there as well. And I try not to be utilitarian about certain things, because I just feel like, just because there's more of something doesn't mean it's any more or less value. But I feel like sometimes you've got to play the long game in the veterinary world, and if you're going to have, if we as veterinary community are going to have vets, breeders and clients on our side, they need to have faith and trust that we're doing things in line with their wishes, but also to our best of our ability. And that's just not our understanding of how things work, but also in a welfare sense and a mental health sense, and all the things that we need to do. So yeah, just consider that. The next thing says, can we say no and mass strike? Yes, we could mass strike. There is an appetite for it, to be honest with you. So yeah, it's very, very, very unlikely that will happen. I think what I'm asking for is a shared understanding by some group of some sort, and whether or not and what that will be is going to be interesting. Whether it's the BVA, whether it's RSPCA, whether it's Dogs Trust, whether it's all of them, whether it's like we've seen with IVC saying they'll support them. You know, you might find that the big corporates are saying, like, look, we're not getting involved. And if the big corporates get involved and say not a chance, you know, the MediVets as well and the CVS as well, and they all get together and say, we're supporting the people who say no. You know what, like 60% or 70% of practices in the UK are owned by those three corporates, I believe. Don't quote me on that. You know, then you may have a situation where it makes it very difficult to chase up each one of these. But again, you need a uniform game plan. And so unless there's a legal challenge to this legislation that stops it from being brought into effect on when the dates say, which I believe there is one, whether or not that will come to anything, who knows. But you know, it's very hard to say. Without a unified stance, like a mass strike would probably elicit, obviously, and then I think it's kind of will be dripping through this process and kind of seeing how it manifests and seeing how well it comes forward. So yeah, this next person has said they're dreading it as a vet nurse. Completely understand. You know, from a personal perspective, you always have to prioritize your ability to pour from your cup. If this is exhausting, then by all means, people like Vet Life, or seeking some type of support and making sure that your team and your managers, whether you're a locum vet or not, whatever, you're in a safe space where you can actually seek type of respite from that interaction if it's negatively affecting you. And I think the mental health issue is something that a lot of vets are and veterinary professionals are very concerned about, and as they should be. I think my concern really about that, just to expand on that, is that so much about the grassroots people who are been dealing with XL Bullies for years now, and the concerns and shouting about it and screaming about it for donkeys, haven't been tied into this process at all. And that's sad. So yeah, it is sad. And the last question here is large breed neutering before a year because joint issues. Yep, it's a very good point. We do have data in a variety of large breeds and attached concerns about neutering, you know, not only for that, for joint issues, neoplasia, you know, you name it. And, you know, I guess due to the quote unquote genetic dilution of XL Bullies across the board, we don't know what they're predisposed to be, because in themselves we can all agree that they don't fit an exact idea, just that there is a decent amount of inbreeding, and that certain sizes and categories of bullies, XL Bullies and things of that group have different bits from different breeds, and that also complicates things really. So I think the most important thing here is to, and I guess this is kind of start of the wrap up, I guess, is that this point is not made based on a welfare decision. You know, this isn't a welfare decision for dogs, at least. It's presented as a welfare decision for humans. But there is a huge context of creating a situation which doesn't really remedy the problem. It shifts it. And it's something that is a key part of this. Like, it's shifting. It's saying, look, here is a disease, and instead of treating the disease, we're just going to, like, block its existence. It's probably a terrible example, but the idea is it's a plaster situation. That's probably a better one. It's putting a plaster over a wound. It's like, well, why did I get cut? So, well, that's there's a plaster. You know, you can't see it, so it's not a problem. And you know, ultimately the origin of the issue is still out there, as we feel is the issue. you know, we've had, you know, Staffies and Dobermans and Rottweilers and Malinois, like all these dogs have the potential to be powerful dogs that you know, if left off the lead, can cause us injury in a greater context. But you know, we do accept at least that there's a huge context for the carer's involvement, and you know, there's lots of thoughts about how we would approach that. All of them don't come within the context of what we're doing now, effectively, because it doesn't feel like we're looking for anything positive from this. So, you know, I guess, you know, we need to be concerned about, you know, talking about welfare issues is something that we as vets and veterinary professionals are concerned about. This is not really the prime concern of the government. And so fighting on that line is a sad one, but it's not the job that they're prioritising, really. You know, I would say that we've almost we have a situation where we're creating a greater gap with certain looks of breeds. You know, XL Bullies, Pitbull Staffies. And for me, it's kind of entrenched in this deeper rooted issue of how in society we actually look after dogs, you know, and I've said this before many times before on Instagram and Twitter and things like that, and talks and panels, that we don't actually value dogs in the way that we think we do. We don't at all. What we do is we expect them to meet a standard of a version of an animal that we want as owners, and owners being underlined here, like they are our property, and I think for a lot of families with dogs in them, the dogs become family members after a point, once they satisfy that expectation that we've attributed to them. And even at that point, we still have this quite big gap between humans and animals. And this is something that I was speaking about, or was spoken about recently in RSPCA talk, I think the Wilberforce lecture, I believe it was called, where there was a huge discussion about the direction of the animal welfare future, and our relationship as humans to animals needs to change. And because there is this sliding scale, which is not based on anything but culture, effectively, and that is ultimately where I feel like a lot of the deep-rooted issues are. But if we even separate that thought process of the culture of pit bulls and XL bullies and how wider community see them versus, I don't know, other big dogs, like let's say a Great Dane or whatever, and how we create that, well, these are better dogs and these are bad dogs, and you know, and how easy it is to attribute and dehumanize one group and humanize another group, almost without even batting an eyelid. And that comes through not just from legislation, but also comes through in adverts. It comes from how we speak about dogs. It comes from how we speak about other non-dog animals, you know, but also speak about other humans as well. It is all very much a sliding scale, because the same rules of how we demonize and celebrate is something that happens quite often within our day-to-day basis. And actually that is this conversation about XL bullies versus other dogs, and this breed is bad and this breed is good, is actually a really good reflection, a kind of microcosm of how much we care about each other, effectively. And I think that is a really important point to kind of highlight. And I guess who in our culture is the arbitrator of what is good or bad? And, you know, what is the right or wrong side of welfare? Well, we know welfare is an ever-changing field, and it's often based on a variety of different things. But at roots, welfare is an ideological standpoint, and then has science and things like that to add to it. And so that is something that we need to look at going forward. Breed-specific legislation. I think there is a almost uniform rejection of the position, and I think how the next step looks is, I don't think anything changes with this particular legislation. I don't think it's very likely to. I think we're likely to lots of people are going to just see how it goes. It depends if any type of legal attempts or challenges do come to anything. And it also will be up to the powers that be in the veterinary community to advocate for vets, and also kind of funnel that information back to the government, and how much pressure will and can be applied, and whether or not it'll be a compromise or a hardline no. And I guess with regards to anything, it's if you don't like it, you have an opportunity to vote for something different. And if you shout loud enough, people at some point will have to start listening. I think the real issue, and do you know what? To be honest with you, with regards to XL Bullies, because there is an appetite for it in the UK, it is a tenuous position, and we know we have political parties, Labour and the Conservatives, really trying to not be, either trying to be very outspoken to kind of get polarised votes and shore up support from certain sects within their own party, or not say anything and just try and float in the middle and try to appeal to kind of a centrist position, which is kind of safe, and kind of plodding through that as a matter of trying not to upset the boat too much. I don't think anyone is a genius who understands politics about which party I'm referring to in both cases. But I think it's going to be one of those situations that if we want something to change, we're going to have to hold a line, and we're going to hold ourselves to account for the types of things that we're bringing new vets into. I know myself, at least, that I think that if you're going to rush legislation through, and it is rushed, there's no better way of putting it, you need to make a real attempt to involve the people it's going to affect most. And it feels as if that we've been left out because it doesn't serve the purposes of a political landscape. And that's a shame, really, because ultimately it's just being plopped onto us. And I think that is a real issue. But in this world where polarized issues are leading the way the world is defined, it's not really surprising, and we'll have to see. We'll see where we go with that. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps up my breakdown of it. There was a couple of things that I kind of added on the fly, so excuse me if they're a little bit blurry on the edges, but I think the kind of gist there is a nice little update for everyone from what I understand about what to anticipate and what to expect. And I guess the TLDR is, or the shortened version, the more concise version is, there are certain dates, we have that information. How that will look in the nuances and within the cracks and the minutiae is very vague. The breed specific information we have is very vague and doesn't hold up to scrutiny as it stands, and will probably require a variety of different second-hand experts to be the adjudicators of that, and how that will look, we don't know. There's a bunch of concerns about the behavioural standards that we're asking of people, the financial standards we're asking of people to kind of follow. And all information that we have from Pitbull Terriers, at least, shows that it's pretty vague, and from at least from the stats that we have in the past, it doesn't really work. And that is ultimately a cultural, but also pretty clear line about shifting the blame between breeds based on whatever is fashionable and legal, and it's very easy to just do that, basically. I think something needs to be said for the veterinary community standing up and having some type of understanding or uniform response, in the same way that we had a uniform response to that breed specific legislation doesn't work very well. It would be nice to see something else in that line, and we'll see how it goes. As always, it's important for people to protect their mental health, but we just don't have the understanding of, if we reject euthanasia as vets or veterinary professionals, what that actually means, and if anything will come of it at all. but we also have to consider the welfare of these animals if we don't euthanize, and then the clients, owners, carers don't go out and euthanize, and then they end up getting caught up in something else which could have a greater welfare concern. And so paying, doing due diligence on each case is probably the most important thing that we can at the moment. Let's see. So I hope that was really informative. And by all means, leave some comments. And yeah, if you like this type of short form thing, the opposite of short form, long form information, it's something that might be open to doing on a variety of topics, not even just veterinary, just anything, and maybe kind of doing this type of what's interesting to me or whatever, then by all means leave me a comment on what types of topics you might like me to cover, or if you like it or if you don't like it, suggestions. I'm very open to anything as long as it's constructive. All right, thank you very much, guys.